September 26th,
Oh,
2000.
for a little while yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Still is.
Okay, then I am in the
There you go.
shot. And I'm Matthew Worley along with Tom Kennedy. Today is September 26, 2016, they tell me. We are here in Oxnard, California, and we're both members of Pacific Pioneer Broadcasters.
Yes.
Okay. All right, we are here, and let me say to you, Tom Kennedy, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us and allowing us in your home.
My pleasure.
And also thanks to Randy West, who's with us, another longtime PPBer who has helped with the research on this
Yes.
and given much good advice and also helped on the lighting, too.
Which helps. Every bit helps.
Okay. You were, before we begin, born James Nars. What was your full name at birth?
James Edward Nars, N-A-R-Z.
Birth date?
2/26/27, February 26, 1927.
And
Oh, yeah.
also, as
Very
we
good
know,
year.
the brother of Jack Nars, another famous
That's right,
game
yeah.
show host. Were there other siblings or just the two of you?
No, we have a sister. She lives in Las Vegas. She's still alive, and she's the youngest one. Jack's the oldest. I'm in the middle, and then we have a younger sister.
You have expressed in the past that Jack was the first of the two of you to take an interest in broadcasting.
Not only that, but it came from out of the blue. We were born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. World War II came along, and my brother was in the Air Force, and he was ferrying planes from back and forth across the states from Wilmington, Delaware, out here to Santa Monica. And when one of his first trips out here, he flew into Santa Monica. It landed with all those palm trees and the balmy weather, and he says, "Boy, this is it." And he decided at that point that he was going to, after the war, if he got through it all right, he was going to come out here. When I say if he got through it, he flew the hump, they call it, the Himalayas, China, Burma, India area, and he had the Distinguished Flying Cross. And so anyway, he did survive the World War II. And when he came home, he decided that for whatever reason, with no idea, there's none of it in the family, he wanted to be a radio announcer. And came out west and heard that there was a radio professional school for training radio announcers. And enrolled in that school, went to that school. The school taught both announcing and engineering, but he concentrated on the announcing part, hadn't even finished his engineering. When you finish the engineering course, if you're good, if you qualify, you earn the first-class radio telephone operator's license, which you have to operate a transmitter. But he didn't even wait for that. He hadn't even gotten that first-class ticket yet when a man came into the studio one day looking for talent, and my brother wasn't supposed to audition, but he went into the audition room, auditioned, and the guy hired him right on the spot. And that was 1946, I believe, maybe 47. He went down to KXO, El Centro, California, right on the border. That was his first radio job. And he was in heaven because he had finally entered this realm of broadcasting that he had always dreamt about. And to make a long story short, he and I corresponded over the years, and then over the months to come, and I survived World War II also because I went to the island, Rhode Island. I was in the Navy. I was only in for a year, but anyway, when the Japanese heard I was in, they surrendered. I mean, it may have been coincidental, but I don't think so. Well, anyway, so Jack said, "What are you doing?" He's in California now, and I'm still in Louisville. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm drinking beer is what I'm doing, and not knowing what I'm going to do. I guess I'll go to the University of Louisville." And he said, "Why don't you come on out here?" And he said, "You have some GI Bill, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Come on out here and give this a shot." I said, "What is this?" He said, "Radio." I said, "Oh, I don't think I would be quite." He said, "What are you talking about? Come on out and try it." I did. I got on a Greyhound bus, never forget it, one of the greatest trips of my life. Took 2 or 3 days to get here. Loved it. Loved every moment of it. Got here, enrolled in the school, fell in love with radio. 10 months later, I graduated, got my first class radio telephone operator's license, which made me a combo man, as they say in those days. I guess they still are. That means a company could save money by hiring these young punks like me who could both be an engineer and an announcer. And so I got a job in Louisville, my hometown, Louisville, Kentucky, 1948. And that was the beginning of my career, or my broadcasting career. Fell in love with the whole, haven't worked a day since.
Well, let's back up just one moment and let me ask you this. Because Jack did take an interest in broadcasting before you did, do you recall what yours and Jack's first association with radio was, in the sense that as a kid, the shows you listened to that you most remember as a kid?
Oh, well, yes. I used to listen to Fred Allen, Jack Benny, Amos and Andy in those days, Fibber McGee and Molly, all of those shows. Those were the network shows. And then locally, I knew all the local guys. As a matter of fact, that's one thing about broadcasting that always impressed me was the voice quality of a lot of these people. There was a fellow by the name of Livingston Gilbert who had a newscast in WHAS, and I was a big fan of his, so I wrote him a letter, and I never got an answer, and it crushed me. I thought he was just sitting there waiting for me to hear from me. But anyway, so I did have a glimmer or some appreciation of people who sat behind a microphone and made whatever they were saying sound interesting. And anyway, I don't even know why I'm talking about that. It just popped into my mind. I never dreamt that I would be in a radio, and when I got in and got that first job, all I wanted to do was be a disc jockey. I mean, that was the big thing in 1948. And so I became a disc jockey, but I did everything. I did the news. When you're with a small station, you do it all. I swept out the studios. I had a morning show called Yawn Patrol. Oh, it was great. I just loved it, ate it up. Stayed there in Louisville, and then eventually started migrating, going from there to Missouri, also in radio, and University of Missouri at the same time. And I just very gradually worked around on 2 or 3 stations back there. But I say back there, in Kentucky and Missouri. And finally, once again, in conversations with Jack, he said, well, why don't you try coming out here and give it a shot? And once again, I said, oh, I couldn't do anything like that. That's way over my head. He said, well, why don't you come out and give it a shot? I did. I got some part-time work at a little station in the San Fernando Valley. I was thrilled to death. I was on the air in Los Angeles, California. No longer a combo man now. I'm just an announcer. I outgrew the engineer license. And it just went from there.
Well, let's stop a moment here in the sense that Jack came out here in those years, and he went to school and got his first job out of school here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But you didn't. You got your first job back east.
Yeah.
Did you try to get a job out here and not find one, or did you
No, I didn't even try. I didn't even try, no. When I graduated from the school, it was called the Don Martin School of Radio Arts. And then when I was there, it became the Don Martin School of Radio and Television Arts. This tells you, this is when television was creeping into the picture. Now I got off course. Why didn't I work here? I didn't feel anywhere near qualified. My brother had a lot of natural talents. It didn't surprise me that he was an instant hit out here. But when I graduated, I picked up Broadcasting Magazine, which of course is the Bible. Anything that's going on in broadcasting is in Broadcasting Magazine. So I read about an outfit that had a CP, which is a construction permit, for a new station in Louisville, Kentucky. And I said, hey, they're going to build a new station in Louisville, Kentucky. And so I read about it. I wrote them a letter, told them that I was a Louisville native. I said, I'm an announcer / engineer, and I'm very much interested in joining your ranks if you would be kind enough to consider me. And they said, would you please send us a disc, which I did, the discs, acetate disc. And then the chief engineer, the guy who was going to be the chief engineer, called me, and he said, so you have a first-class ticket, huh? I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, I'm looking for somebody who's going to help me build the transmitter because it hasn't been built yet. We got most of the parts in. But so he said, but I would like to think about using you as an announcer and also as an engineer. How does that sound to you? I said, it sounds great to me. They hired me. My dad offered, when he heard me talking to the engineer one day, and the engineer said, I got to find a little warehouse around here where we can put this transmitter together. And Dad said, use my garage if you want to. And we did. We used my dad, my family's garage, and built the transmitter for that station. They're in WLOU, the station known as Lou. So anyway, we built the station, put it on the air, and off and running.
Well, it's interesting that you went to the Don Martin School of, as it was later called, the Don Martin School of Broadcasting, where many, many famous broadcasters went. Your brother Jack, in those years, talked about the fact that he had a very strong Southern accent, and that he had to diminish that accent to be able to work professionally. And being from the South, did you feel that you had much of an accent when you were a younger person?
Well, that's a great question. I'll tell you why. I had never heard Jack say that, and I didn't think he did. We were both from Kentucky, period. Jack did not have a Southern accent that I heard. Of course, I wasn't exactly the one to judge, perhaps. But I had an accent. I had not only had an accent, I had it all up in the head. I whined. And there are the number of Southern accents. Some are nice, smooth, low, Georgia and Louisiana type. And then there are the hillbillies who talk like this, and now I was a hillbilly. And I talked through my nose, and I had head tones and all that. They pounded that out of me at the Don Martin School of Radio Arts. They pounded it out of me. They gave me constant tapes, things to read, and then I'd bring it in the next day, and they would critique me. And I had to learn how to use, I didn't know what a diphthong was, like House to me was a house. They said, no, it's a house, not a house, it's a house. They said, say Horse. I said, horse. They said, no, it's a horse. Hor. I said, oh, I see. So I had to learn how to say horse and house and a long I. Instead of time, it was time. But they had to pound it out. I mean, I still guess maybe I still have lingerings of it. I don't know. But I had a terrific nasal Southern accent.
When you, after working back east, as you mentioned, when you did finally come out here, Jack encouraged you again. Had you built a lot of confidence by that point, or did you still feel that maybe you weren't qualified to work out here?
I was building, just a brick at a time. I finally got to the point where I felt I was good enough to be considered a personality in Louisville. And then when I went to Missouri, I had a successful show there too. I realized that I had something. I mean, I had a presence of some sort. Didn't know to what extent I had that presence, except that I could feel it building a bit. And I was very fortunate in being able to pick up jobs. If one job went under, I had not too much problem getting the next job. So I finally realized at that point, and once again with Jack's encouragement, to jump on the springboard and try to go to the West Coast. In broadcasting, there were three major locations. It began in Chicago, there's New York, and then there's Los Angeles. In that order, too. A lot of the early shows came out of Chicago, early soaps and newscasts and whatever. Then in New York. L.A. was a Hollywood land, it was movie land, but radio was building and building and building. So when I finally decided to make a jump into one of the major markets, I decided instead of Chicago and New York, I'd go out where Jack was in Hollywood or in Los Angeles. And sure enough, it was burgeoning. It was CBS was building a big studio, and NBC was. They were all burgeoning. The three networks. There were only three then, and how sweet it was. Loved it. Didn't have that many stations to go to, network-wise. But anyway, so I came out, got into radio, and landed a job with, once again, a new station out in the San Gabriel Valley, KPOL. It was called KPOL because they played polkas. And they played polkas because there was a show on television that was red hot called the Lawrence Welk Show. One of the hottest things. Ed Sullivan on the East Coast, Lawrence Welk on the West Coast. I mean, it was really hot.
Let's pause for a moment.
Sure.
Welk goes on locally here, KTLA, in 1950. He goes on the network in 55.
Yeah.
So was he hot here locally, or was this already at the time he was hot?
He was hot
internationally?
locally, and when I came out, he was just locally. He was down at the Aragon Ballroom, whatever it was called,
At the Lick Pier.
The Aragon Pier, and in 1957, the Plymouth Corporation bought the show, and took him network on ABC. They were looking for a spokesman, and so they picked me. I was still Jim Nars at that time, incidentally. In my early radio show career, I was Jim Nars because that was my name. And when I came to the West Coast, Jack and I finally realized there were so many people, believe it or not, who confused the two. I have no idea how that's possible, but they did. Maybe it's mannerisms. I don't know what it is. We talked about me changing my name, but we hadn't gotten around to it. But when the Plymouth Corporation wanted to hire me as their spokesman for that year of 1957, they asked me if I would consider changing my name. I said, funny you should ask, because my brother and I have been talking about that. So I went to lunch with some agency people and Plymouth people, and we talked about names, and we came up with the name Tom Kennedy. So that was 1957. Tom Kennedy was born in 1957. I'm Jim Nars from the ground up to here, and I'm from here up, I'm Tom Kennedy, because I had 4 kids called Nars. You can work out the math on that. Anyway, that's the way it happened. So back to Welk. Welk was red hot locally. Then when he went national on ABC, he just blew the lid off. He was just very, very big, and I worked on that show with him. I mean, at that period of time, I was for the Plymouth Corporation. I was the announcer on. I misspoke. Plymouth didn't buy Lawrence Welk. Dodge bought Lawrence Welk.
That's right.
Plymouth bought at that same time. I confused because the Plymouth Dodge Corporation was growing by leaps and bounds, and they split it up. The Dodge people, and there's another one in there, bought Groucho Marx with the announcer Lou Crosby. Another person. Plymouth Corporation bought Lawrence. No, I'm getting it mixed up. Plymouth Corporation bought Betty White show called Date with the Angels, and I was the spokesman. And the Dodge Corporation bought Welk with Lou Crosby as the host. That's the way it worked. And George Fenneman was the other guy I'm trying to think of for Dodge DeSoto. It was George Fenneman and Bill Lundigan, Mary Costa. So anyway, the Chrysler Plymouth Corporation was very big in those days, very active on television. Those were the days when they didn't just buy spots; they bought shows. They owned you, but it was great. I worked for them for at least 1 year. It was wonderful. But that was the launching year for Tom Kennedy, in 1957.
Well, let's talk about that. You, Welk was sponsored, as you mentioned, by Dodge, with the Dodge Dancing
Yeah.
Party. Your brother, Jack Norris, was working for Ford.
That's right.
So,
That's why the Plymouth people asked me if I want to change my name, because they wanted to hire me, but they didn't want the name Norris, which was previously connected with Ford, now being connected with Plymouth. So so it all fit.
and your brother was, I think, the announcer for Tennessee Ernie Ford at
Oh,
that
yes.
time. Okay, so there's the Ford
Yes.
Association.
And there's that Ford Association too. That's correct.
So a number of these first jobs that you get in broadcasting, just as Jack encouraged you in the beginning, Jack actually helps you get some of these early jobs out
You
here
bet he
too.
did. When I got off that Greyhound bus, I didn't know from Shinola. I mean, I didn't know where to go, what to do. So I knew that, so I got a map, and I knew my brother was in North Hollywood, and he was busy at that time, so I got a bus schedule, and after 2 or 3 transfers from downtown LA, I finally made it out to North Hollywood and went knocking on the door on the apartment where he lived. And the lady, isn't that funny? I just remembered her name, Mary Lou Kaiser. She was the landlady. She opened the door, and I stood there, and I said, hi. And she said, you're Jack's brother, aren't you? I said, yeah. She said, well, come on in. He told her, he said, my brother's going to show up sometime. So anyway, she brought me in, gave me a glass of milk and a piece of cake or whatever, and that was my greeting. And we waited for Jack to come home. And so when the next day, so I said, so I don't even know where to go. He said, I'm going to get you a list. He said, CBS Radio, the sales staff has a big, huge poster on their wall down there that lists all the radio stations, the few television stations. I think there were 7 TV stations at that time, and all of the ad agencies. I hadn't even thought about such a thing as ad agency. But ad agencies are the ones who really hire you on behalf of the sponsors. So he said, I'm going to give you that, and then from there on, you can just go out and start pounding the pavement and see where you go. So he got one of those posters, and I went through and gleaned out the ones that I thought were the most logical ones for me: radio stations, television stations, agencies. And I started pounding the pavement, writing letters, knocking on doors, and whipped up a little brochure, and a little calling card, and so I just papered the town.
Now, your first radio job out here, if I have the notes correctly, is KGIL?
Yeah,
is
in
that
the
right?
valley.
But now, do you get that job before Jack helps you or with Jack's help?
No, I got that actually. Oh no, Jack had nothing to do with it. I'm trying to remember. First of all, I had heard that they were looking for, this was, I don't know what the year, 1947, I guess. I don't know. I hadn't graduated yet. I don't remember the year. Anyway, whatever the year was, I heard they were looking for a summer replacement, which is very common. And I went out there, and when I went in, the guy said, are you any kin to Jack Norris? I said, yeah, I'm his brother. And so to that extent, maybe Jack helped. Jack didn't call him in advance. As a matter of fact, he asked me if I was any kin. I said, he's my brother. So he said, yeah, I know Jack. And so anyway, he just brought me in, and I auditioned, and he hired me. Not just based upon that, but he happened to hire me. That's the way I think Jack actually helped me most. Sending me in the right direction and blazing a trail which I followed. It's like he's walking along throwing breadcrumbs, and I'm coming along after him and gobbling them up. I'm just following him around like a little puppy dog. And it was a good thing to do because he did very well. He was quite talented, if I may say so, about my own brother.
There's something very interesting here, and it's quite unusual. Many siblings, if they go into a particular field of endeavor, they oftentimes don't want their siblings tagging along. They don't want their big brother or little brother, especially little brother or little sister, perhaps being involved in that. They want to stake out their own territory, and sometimes they kind of jealously guard that territory. So for Jack to be as benevolent as he was, and not only did he not say, hey, don't do this thing I'm doing, but he actively helped you. That's a very, I think, unique thing among siblings. Do you have any thoughts on what it was about the two of you that you had that relationship?
We never thought in any other terms other than that. we were always, even though we were competitors, we were brothers. I mean, what the hell? We're brothers. And that's above anything. Forget about competition. But we competed in many, later on, in many audition, on camera and off. There's plenty of room for everybody, he said. And there was. He didn't worry about me, nor should he. I didn't concern myself about him. I never considered it to be a problem, and neither did he, and we got along just fine.
You went from KGIL to KPOL, as
Yeah.
you mentioned, and at a certain point, you get one of your early television gigs. Again, if my notes are correct, you can tell me, due to Jack, and it's substituting for Jack as an announcer.
Yeah, now there's where a concrete example of how he flat out helped me right up front. It was television now we're talking about, not radio. We're talking about television. And Jack was an announcer, doing commercials. He was doing commercials for an outfit in L.A. called, it was a men's clothing outfit called Bars Manufacturing. And so when they hired him as their spokesman, he became kind of known for that, and so they called him Jack Nars, the man from Bars. And it caught on, and he worked, and he did very well. Then along came a network show called Space Patrol, one of the first coast-to-coast shows that was filmed on the West Coast. They didn't have transatlantic cable at that time, or transcontinental cable. They filmed the show at ABC in Hollywood, and then I take that back. They fed the show to New York. Then they played a Kinney on the West Coast. That's the way it went. The reason I mention all of this, I know I'm using many more words than are necessary, but Jack had to be at the studio at 4:30. And he had a 5:30, he had a 10 o'clock Friday evening commercial show to do for Bar Manufacturing Company. So he went into his boss and said, I've got a brother who's in the business, and I can't do that Friday night show anymore. Would you mind if he came in and spelled me? And the guy said, well, I don't know. Is he any good? Jack said, oh, yeah. And he said, have he got any experience? I said, yeah, he's good. So the guy brought me in, talked to me, and he said, okay, we'll give your kid brother a chance. And so I went on the air doing a commercial for Bar Manufacturing Company because I was Jack's brother. I was terrible, I think. I came home that night, and I asked my wife, did I do it all? She said, because she had the script at home. I left. She said, you got every word in. I was afraid I was going to go. I didn't use a teleprompter or anything. I just memorized it. But I was petrified. Managed to do it, though, and stayed on for a few weeks, whatever it was. I don't remember how long I did it, every Friday night, for a few weeks anyway, and I started feeling a little bit better, and getting a little bit used to, everything's a gradual process. So anyway, that's the answer to your question. Jack Nars definitely got me that job, and it was my first on camera in Hollywood. I did a little commercial in Louisville for a beer company, but anyway, I did the first on camera in Louisville, in Los Angeles.
Now, this, for the record, if I'm correct, is the George V. Denny Jr.
That's right.
Town
Gosh, you've
Hall
done your
meeting
homework.
of the air.
That was the Friday night show. George V. Denny Jr. was a commentator. He had been a newsman, and he morphed into a commentator, which means he didn't just do the news. He commented on what's going on in the world, in America. And George V. Denny Jr., and then he had a show called the George V. Denny Jr. Town Hall Meeting of the Air, and Jack was the announcer on that show. So that's the tie-in there.
Now, at that time, you were still Jim Nars.
Yes, I was, yeah.
So when you do make the change, because you're becoming somewhat known and you need to make the change to associate, to distinguish yourself from your brother, where's the name Tom Kennedy come from?
Well, when the Plymouth, as I said, we had lunch one day with the agency people and the Plymouth people and tried to decide. We sat in this luncheon, big long table, and we started throwing out names. And I said, "How about?" They were all kinds of Mike, John, Herman, Frank, whatever. And I said, "How about what was the first one?" I said, "Rick." I said, "How about Rick Kennedy?" And they said, "Oh God." They said, "Rick sounds too much like rock. It's too Hollywoody." They said, "Kennedy's all right because you got an Irish puss, so Kennedy would be okay." And so somebody else said, "Well, then make it Tom Kennedy." And so I said, "Well, okay." They looked at me and said, "Well, what do you think of Tom Kennedy?" I said, "It's fine with me," and that's the way I got it. And see, a lot of people say, "Why did you keep the name Jim?" And the answer, in other words, that going from Jim Nars to Jim Kennedy. You keep the first name and just change the last. I said, "No, if you're going to change it, do the whole thing." And so anyway, that's the way Tom Kennedy came up. Then later on, not too much later, people said, "Oh, you picked Kennedy because of John F. Kennedy." I said, No. John F. Kennedy was a budding young senator at that time. And they said, "Well, so what's the kin?" I said, "Well, yeah, we're kin, all right. Jack Kennedy's mother and my mother are mothers. That's it." But I had no idea John F. Kennedy was going to become who he became.
Did you have any, sometimes people in broadcasting, for example, or in the press in some form, they have a name and they're trying to build that name into something, and sometimes they're reticent to change their name and divorce themselves from that. Of course, yours was a unique position because of your brother. Did you have any reticence to say, I want to be Jim Nars, I don't want to be somebody else, or did that matter to you?
No, I long before I changed the name, I knew it had to be done. As long as Jack and I were in the same business, it had to be done. It didn't make any sense to have two guys with much the same name who had, as I said, enough in common that it confused people. So I readily gave up my name, and I was ready for it when it happened. No resentment, no nothing. I was looking forward to it.
Did you change your name legally, or did you just professionally change your name?
Both. I still use Nars on my legal papers, but I also use Kennedy on some of my legal, my driver's license says Kennedy. So I can use both, but I did change it so I can use it. So the tax man knew how to find me.
So this
no matter
is
what go ahead.
the year that you made that name change was 1957. Now it's 1958 that you began a program called Big Game, and this I think is your first association with game shows.
No,
you had done a game show prior to that.
Yeah.
What was your first one?
I did a local show called Temptation over at KTLA. I did a show called, I did a very nice show I really loved called Dr. IQ, which came from radio. I have a lady in the balcony, doctor. And I did Dr. IQ locally on the ABC station, and it also went network for only 13 weeks, but it went network for that period of time. That was 1950.
Okay. Well, now,
I guess.
the notes
7.
here, which is part of the chronology that you gave me off camera, list Big Game as June 1958 to September 1958, and then they list Dr. IQ as October 58. So coming right on the heels of Big Game.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yes, that is true. Because when they called me, yes. I was doing Big Game, which was in Burbank at NBC. I was told, incidentally, it was the first game show to be telecast in color. They had those big, huge cameras in living color. Anyway, I was doing, you're right, I have to correct myself if I don't know where that other information came from, probably me. I do get dates mixed up. I was doing Big Game when they called me if I would audition for a show called Dr. IQ, which was going to be a local show. And in between rehearsal and showtime on Big Game, I went out to the ABC station and auditioned for Dr. IQ. And so when Big Game, and incidentally, I got the job, make a long story short, and then when Big Game collapsed, Dr. IQ took up from there. So that's true. Dr. IQ followed Big Game. I thought it was before, but it wasn't.
So you get the job for Big Game 1958, NBC, network job. Had to be an exciting assignment for you. How did
Yes.
you, and for those who don't recall, Big Game is something like a television version of Battleship.
It's exactly what it is. Instead of battleships and destroyers and things on a graph, they'd use animals, a tiger, an elephant, and alligator. In other words, they were magnetic plastic animals, and they put them on a board, and the contestant, the opposing contestant behind the screen, fired shots and tried to shoot those animals. I know it sounds silly. It was very difficult to shoot. Pardon me, to take off, because another problem they ran into on that, which they hadn't anticipated, was in those bright lights in color. The graph that had the animals on it, when these lights lit from behind, you couldn't see them.
And the one Kenny I saw, it was a little hard to tell.
I say you couldn't. It was very difficult. So that went against it. The show didn't do very well, but it went for 13 weeks, and it was on Saturday night, and it was on it was on NBC, and I was in heaven.
Can you give us a sense, how did you, because this is a big network job, how'd you get that opportunity to do Big Game? How'd that come about?
They auditioned everybody in town. They ran all kinds of. I have no idea how many people they auditioned, but I was one of them. And the guy who wrote the show, who created the show, his name was Jackson Stanley, was a fan of mine. When I say a fan of mine, he used to watch me on some local shows that I did. I don't know if I was doing Farmer John yet, but anyway, I was doing local commercials on a local show that he had seen, and he liked my work. Let's put it that way. But he wasn't the only one, because the network had its say, and other people had their. There were a number of people involved in picking the host. But so all I can say, I can't answer that other than they auditioned other people and they chose me.
Now, the chronology here of Big Game lists it having run 15 episodes. So, you get this network job. Was it intended to be a summer replacement job, or was it intended to go as a
No, it
series?
was intended to go. As far as they were concerned, it was intended to go. Period.
Well, when you got that first big network job and then it didn't run very long, was that very discouraging for you, or did you feel like, well, it's okay and I'm going to keep going? And
Not really. I took it for what it was worth. I said, I'm sorry that happened, but that's the way it goes in the business. You have to understand that not every show hits and connects. And so when it didn't connect, I sat and watched the show, and I too said, it isn't working, is it, guys? And it wasn't. It just wasn't working. It wasn't a very good show. So I had no regrets. I had no resentments, no nothing. I was just thankful for the fact that I had one more little notch in my holster.
now, there's one other thing that's really noteworthy about Big Game when I was watching the Kinescope, and that is that this is, as best I can tell, your first pairing with the announcer John Harlan. Another PPB founding member and another man with whom you would work many, many times in the intervening years on game shows. Do you have any memory of how you got it paired with John Harlan on that first game?
I didn't even remember John being on that show. I remember Wendell Niles Jr., Wendell Niles, rather.
Maybe there was more than one announcer on the show.
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe John also came into the picture because Wendell Niles, oh, I know another one. It may have been John Jacobs was also, Johnny Jacobs was in that.
He was on some of your early shows too. Maybe I've got the
think he
notes
did
wrong on that.
Big
He may
Game.
have been the announcer on that.
When it came to announcers, and especially on shows that are in, we'll call it the formative stages, it was not at all unusual for the network to bring in a different announcer every week until they found somebody that they really fell in love with. So they used Wendell Niles. I believe they used Johnny Jacobs, and very possibly John Harlan, because John Harlan was one of the best announcers in the business at that time, and as far as I'm concerned, ever.
I apologize for the notes here. Yes, your first pairing with John Harlan is You Don't Say.
Yeah.
Your
Oh,
first
yes.
one with
Yeah.
Johnny Jacobs, with whom you would also work later
Yeah,
again, is The Big Game. That's true.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yes, You Don't Say came along. Oh, Lord, now that
Well-
was explosive.
Before we go to You Don't Say, let's talk, if we may, a moment about Dr. IQ, because
yeah.
you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Here's a show, long association with radio.
Yeah.
You were, by the time you became the host of that show, there had been several previous hosts.
Yes.
It's a show that you had to have heard before.
Yes.
So when you're called to come in to host a show that has a long history in broadcasting, what were your thoughts on that?
Thrilled to death. Dr. IQ, as you said, I was a fan of the show. It was a great show. It was a quiz professor who called himself Dr. IQ. He wore the mortarboard and the whole thing. And he had two assistants out in the audience with roving microphones, and they would go out in each aisle of the audience and pick out people to participate in. It was a quiz, but it wasn't just a quiz. It was a whimsical quiz. They were whimsical questions with whimsical answers, and they paid off in silver dollars, which was also a catchphrase in those days. Give that man 5 silver dollars, or give that man a box of Mars bars, which is the sponsor. Those days, on that show, there were little catchphrases that developed. Give that person X number of silver dollars was one. Just like years and years later, I can name that tune. The little catchphrases that seemed to catch fire. The other one was give that man a box of Mars bars, and the other one was I have a lady at the balcony, doctor. And there was one feature where one on each show, the announcer would say, I have a lady in the balcony, doctor. And they would cut to him, and he would be up in the balcony with a lady, and she would be the special one for that day. And she got a special series of questions, 1, 2, and 3. And if she got 1 right, she got X number of prizes, and 2 right. And if she got all 3 right, she was the winner, stayed on for the next show, or something like that. Anyway, it was one of those things that I listened to, loved it, and when I was hired for that job, I couldn't believe I was actually becoming the Dr. IQ, which I became for a short while, and I loved it. To this day, I think it's a great format for a quiz.
And this is an unusual show by our modern standards in the sense that there are no real contestants. The contestants are simply the audience.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. So with the fact that you had a different contestant for each question also broadens one, doesn't it? In other words, you have to deal with all kinds of people under all kinds of circumstances. It was an enriching show.
This show is KABC local by the notes here, and then eventually in December of 1958 goes to ABC Network for television,
Yeah.
with you again as the host.
Was
and
it
again,
December? Yeah, okay, or January? I don't know.
well, going by the notes here that we've compiled,
Go with
you compiled and helped us, and I appreciate that.
If I compiled it, watch out.
If they're your notes, we'll assume they're true.
Yeah, baloney.
Again, a show that has a long run locally, but once it goes to network, it only runs 17.
Yeah, I know it.
So
it didn't catch on. I don't know. Well, it was first of all, it was a replacement show is what it was. It was mid-season, as far as the network nighttime season goes. It was mid-season, and so they threw it in, and it didn't work. Let me put it this way. It was doing all right, but it didn't take seed fast enough. So by the time the regular season came along, the network went with new shows and just dropped it.
So that show ends both locally and network, and that's 1959. The next broadcast credit we have here for you is 1963. That's big network credit. Were you working locally in those days, doing radio? Were you doing local TV?
Yeah, I was on KPOL radio. I was the first announcer they had when they went on the air in 1952. 1952 is correct. And I stayed with them until, I don't know when I left them, 1960 or something like that. Anyway, I'm getting lost here. So I was working at radio from 5 o'clock a.m. till about 1 or 2 o'clock. It was a daytimer, and of course my shift was over by then. And in the afternoon, I would go into town and do commercials on TV, whatever. I sold perfume, used cars, anything. I sold a lot of stuff. But the point is, I was on camera in the afternoon. In those days, and to this day, the fastest way to become known in America is to do a series of successful commercials, period. You come in, you're not known by many people, and you're on a commercial that goes, and you go boom, and they see you like this for about 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months, and all of a sudden you're known. It was the fastest rocket you could hop aboard, commercials. And that's what I did. I did commercials. And so by the time, go ahead, you're going to get to You Don't Say, I presume.
Well, I am going to get to that in just a moment, but just for the record, so during the time that, for example, that you didn't have a big network show, you were still doing local radio, and you were still doing some others. So you had still pursuing other broadcast work.
I was
working
working morning, noon, and night. Radio in the daytime, TV at night.
One reference in, again, your notes that you shared of your chronology that I couldn't find anything about is a show called Sundown.
Yeah.
1963, and this is noteworthy because, again, if I understand correctly, this is your first association with a talk show because you would host your own talk show later.
That's correct.
So tell us about Sundown, KABC.
I was just sailing along, doing my thing. A very successful gentleman who was general manager of ABC locally at that time was a fellow by the name of Elton Rule, who later became president of the corporation, of the network, actually. Elton Rule, for whatever reason, was a fan of mine. He watched me growing and developing. And he wanted to do, Mike Douglas had a very successful syndicated show out of Philadelphia. It began, I think, in Cleveland, and then it went, I don't know if he was in Chicago for a while, and he ended up in Philadelphia. And it was a hugely successful syndicated show. Elton, who ran the ABC O&Os in those days, had in mind developing another show like that would begin on the West Coast and then go. He said, we'll start it on the West Coast, and then as it grows, that was his dream, we'll go national with it. And he hired me. But he said, I'm going to put you in with a beautiful young lady named Gussie Moran. I said, oh, really? Gussie Moran was very famous. She was a fine tennis professional, and she became famous because she was the first one to wear bloomers on the court. Not just shorts, but she had bloomers. It was really cute, and she was cute. And she was also provocative. And so he said, I'm going to give you as your co-host Gussie Moran, and we're going to go after the people who are coming home from work and looking for something to do till the 10 o'clock news and all that. So they said, we're going to put in about 5 o'clock. We're going to call it Sundown, when the sun is going down. So it's the end of the day, and before the beginning of the evening, you and Gussie are going to have this talk variety show. I said, great. And we started doing it just for a couple of weeks. And along came a offer, some people, concurrently with that, is that the word? I was called in to audition for a new show called You Don't Say, which was on KTLA at the time, and NBC was thinking about putting it on daytime. Once again, they auditioned everybody, and I was one of them. They would bring a different host in each week over at KTLA, and make a long story short, I got the job. It just so happens I was doing Sundown. I'd just been doing Sundown for a few weeks when I got this show called You Don't Say, which was going to be a network daytime game show, which I thought was just great, except that NBC didn't want me doing the local show. And I said, well, but and they said, no, we don't want you. In those days, the networks were very possessive. Nobody could have a conflict of interest, so to speak. I went in and I had to resign from Sundown. And I sat there with Mr. Rule, and I said, I can't tell you how sad I am. And I said, I know and we hadn't signed a contract yet. It was a handshake deal. And I said, I know we have a handshake deal and I don't want to violate it in any way. I said, but I've got this offer. And I think I'm going to go with the offer. And he says, well, you're young, you're married, you got a couple of kids, you got a network offer. I can't blame you. He says, I'm kind of teed off that this didn't take off like I wanted it to. He said, but go. You have my blessings. He was a wonderful man. He didn't have to. He could have said, I'm going to, we didn't have a written contract, but we did have a contract, just hadn't been signed yet. He said, I could get the lawyers and we could make a thing out of this, but I'm just going to let you go. And he let me go. A wonderful man, one of the best, finest men I ever worked with or for. And so I did. I took You Don't Say, and it was on NBC, and it became a success.
Then You Don't Say is, again, big run, 1963 to 1969, and that's the first time around. It comes back again later. It had to be exciting to get this show and to see it really go. Give us your thoughts on You Don't Say.
Couldn't believe it. Could not believe it. I was the first week that show aired, or not aired, but taped. April Fool, well, no, that's when it went on the air. It was April, no. We taped it, I guess, the last week of March. It went on the air April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1963. The two men who created that show, Bill Yeagerman and Ralph Andrews, after we taped that first show, the very first show, we came back, we're in the dressing room. I believe we did another show that night. We might have come in the next day and did the next show. I can't remember. Anyway, I came in, I took a breath. It felt good out there for a first show. It just felt good. They came in, because both of them were brash and I thought a bit over the top. And they said, "This is a hit show." And I said, "Oh, yeah, well, from your lips. It may not be. But they said, "No, this is a hit show." I said, "Sure." I couldn't believe that, and I wouldn't allow myself to believe that. But it turns out they were right. I didn't believe it. I really didn't. I couldn't allow myself to think that, because I remembered what it was like to go off the air.
Now, you would go on to do a lot of work with Ralph Andrews. You do a number of shows for Ralph Andrews in the intervening years. Give us a sense of Ralph Andrews as a producer. Who was he? What was he like? And what was it like to work with him?
I think I'll pass.
Okay. Well, what about this? That show was produced in association with Desilu.
Yeah.
So
I didn't even know that at the time, but it was, yeah. I didn't know that.
And they didn't, at least to my knowledge. Again, I mentioned Randy West being here, who has a great knowledge of the history of game shows. I don't know them being associated with many game shows.
Well, they were associated to this extent. Lucy owned, was it Paramount or it was Golden West Broadcast?
She owned the lot that Paramount later bought.
The lot, whatever. It's adjacent to Paramount. What's the
Gulf and
General
Western.
Cinema,
No.
General Services lot.
And whatever that lot was,
Yeah.
she owned it. Now, in other words, she was doing her hit show, but she was so powerful over there that her company was spinning off shows. They let her use their studios to spin off whatever she wanted to do. So somebody came into her with a show and said, "We want to put this on the air, and we're going to start out in KTLA, and so if you let us do it here on the lot and with your name, the Desilu Productions connected with it, you will own part of the show." And so they said, fine. So in other words, they made a deal where Desilu owned part of the show. KTLA Paramount, I guess, owned I don't know who all was in on it. But so as far as Lucy was concerned and Desi, they knew that there were other shows on their lot, but they had no idea what they were, where they were going. They didn't pay attention to them. This was a little pipsqueak little show that no one thought much of. But they took it over to KTLA, and it happened to took root, and it ended up on NBC. So it ended up on NBC. Years later, Lucy told me, she said, I didn't know I owned that damn show. She used to play, not You Don't Say, but she used to play body language with me. With me. On that, she was gracious enough to do the show when I happened to be doing it. And somebody said something to her about, well, they said, you owned the show that started him out. You don't say. She said, I didn't even know I owned the show. And I knew what she meant by that. She didn't really pay any attention to it, nor did anyone when it was actually born. But I know I'm using a lot of words, but that's how that symbiotic relationship brewed.
You Don't Say is a word association game, of which there were many word association games on the air in those days, and since you later hosted a version of Password, for that matter.
Yeah.
Give us a sense of You Don't Say. What do you think was unique about it? Why do you think it was such a big success when some of the other word games weren't so successful?
Well, it was a knockoff of Password, to such an extent that Mark Goodson threatened everybody and even came close to You Don't Say with anything he could. He wanted us off the air because he figured it was too close for comfort. They had the same basic format, if you stop to think. People who know game shows. Password had 2 contestants and a host in the middle. The 2 contestants each had a celebrity contestant. So it's 2, 2, and 1. You Don't Say comes along, and it has a contestant and celebrity. It has a contestant celebrity, and it has a host in the middle. And they called it You Don't Say. Password played giving clues to your partner to make them say a given word, a word that was the password. That was the whole game. It played beautifully. It was one of the best, and still is one of the best game shows ever created as far as I'm concerned. You Don't Say was almost the same, only it had a twist on it where you gave a sentence and you left off the last word. That's the word You Don't Say. That word then leads you to, if you put enough clues together, the person, place, or thing that you're dealing with. That's about the best way to describe it. So it was a spin-off, we'll call it, of Password, but it was different. But it played well because it was different enough to have its own flavor. It had its own flavor because you arrived at the clues differently, and when people put the clues together on You Don't Say, putting them not in order, the way they came out was hilarious oftentimes. And so it had a different, that's the word, it had a different flavor. It's like saying they're both ice cream, one's chocolate and one's vanilla, but they're both good.
Now, Mark Goodson, Bill Todman in those days were perhaps the single most important house as far as game show production. Did Mark Goodson actually sue or just threaten to sue over You Don't Say?
On You Don't Say?
Yes.
Someone told me that he had a suit that he was going to take to court. I don't think it ever made it to court. He had a suit ready to go to court, I believe. I can't answer that legally. In New York, he might have lodged it with a court back there. I don't know. But it very quickly, when when they decide whether or not a case is worthy, they have somebody somewhere along the line, some panel has to take a look at it and say, this is worthy of a suit. They looked at these 2 shows and said, we don't think you have a suit here. They said to Mark Goodson. And of course, he stomped and stammered, but his legal people said, you don't have a suit. And over at NBC and at Yeagerman, Andrews Yeagerman Production Company, they said, well, let's help this a little bit. They took me out of the middle. They took the host out of the middle and put him on the end. So they had a contestant and celebrity here, and then another contestant celebrity, and then the host over on the side. It took the curse off of it, so it looked a little bit different, but it was still the same show. And Mark Goodson was talked out of it. He wasn't just talked out of it, he was convinced by his own legal people that he didn't have a case. He wanted to sue, plagiarism, I guess, I don't know what his grounds were, but he claimed it was stolen, but it was a spinoff, and there are a lot of spinoffs in the whole history of not just that.
Well, television is a famously a derivative medium in that sense. If something works, then there'll be 10 more of them next week.
That's what I was trying to say. Thank you.
By this time, now we're talking about, by the time this show goes off the air, it goes off the air in 1969, you've now been involved in game show production as a host almost continually for about 10 years. So you have become, in the mind of Americans by then, surely a game MC, and we think of you today more than anything else, despite your other work as an actor and talk show host, we think of you as a game show host. By the time that you're, say, 10 years into this, and you, by that time, noticed, hey, I'm becoming the game show guy, how did you feel about that?
Well, it happened. It happened to me. I didn't happen to it. By that I mean, I never, as I told you a while ago, all I wanted to be was a disc jockey. And it just so happened these other things happened because of what was going on. When I wanted to become a disc jockey, radio was it. Television was just, we didn't know what it was or how big it was going to be or if it was going to be a bomb or what. We didn't know. So in other words, a game show host, television game show host wasn't even in existence. It just happened. I morphed from radio into television, from announcing into hosting. That's a big step there. But if you think about it and you look back, they go together quite. Because a lot of announcers, when I was doing commercials, I was called upon to do game shows, fashion shows, telethons, charity events of all kinds. And that's what groomed me to be a game show host, or at least that, looking back, I guess that can be said. And so I ended up being a game show host without even thinking about it. And then when somebody said, well, you're a game show host, I said, well, yes, I guess I am. I'm an announcer who became a game show host. And so it was fine with me. I enjoyed it. It was much more than I ever bargained for. I never even thought of it. It was much bigger and broader than just simply being an announcer behind a microphone. There was more to it. And I enjoyed it tremendously.
Your next major broadcast credit is a game credit again, 1970, and that's the syndicated series, It's Your Bet. Now, your participation in this is interesting, much in the same way that you would do later on Password Plus. You came into the show substituting for another host who was ill, and that's Hal March. Hal March, who had been the host of $64,000 Question many years earlier. When you took over this show, did you realize it was serious and that Hal March might be unable to work again and you might end up as the permanent host, or did you not know that?
No, I knew it was serious. I knew him not well at all, but when they told me they wanted me to take over, I went out to see him. And I sat with him one of the last days on Earth for him, I guess. I don't remember exactly, but I went out to see what he knew. I said, I guess you know they're talking to me. He said, yeah, I know. He said, you're going to do It's Your Bet. I said, yeah, how do you feel about that? He said, are you kidding? He said, they couldn't have found, he was terrific. He said, they couldn't have found a better man. That's terrific. Go. He said, have fun. Enjoy. He said, I certainly did. I said, well, I just want you to know that I think you're the best, and I'm flattered to be asked, but I wanted to know how you felt about it. And he says, I couldn't be happier for you. And I started to say, let's have a drink, but he couldn't have a drink. So we just sat there and chatted, and he was wonderful, amiable, almost became like a brother or a father figure to me. He was a terrific guy, and that's how it happened. But my point is he knew about it. They told him. He knew all along. You're going to be replaced. He knew he was terminal. It was all over. It was cancer, and he had X number of days to live.
In the early episodes of your appearance on the show, though, it's still listed as starring Hal March, and you were there as a guest host. How long were you the guest host before you became the official host of the show?
I don't know.
Don't recall?
No, I don't recall.
Well, 1970 is the year of It's Your Bet, and that's another very important year because that's the year of the real Tom Kennedy show.
Yeah.
And when we talked off the air, or off the, I keep saying air, off the tape, I said to you, as much as I've known your work and known your game shows, I had never seen the real Tom Kennedy show, and I wanted to, and you were kind enough to share a tape, which I think was the pilot episode. Again, this is the era of Merv Griffin. It's the era of Mike Douglas. It's the era of a lot of big syndicated talk shows and talk variety shows. And you entered that fray as well. Tell us about the real Tom Kennedy show and how did that come about?
When you are established as a game show host and things are going along smoothly, you either keep on going or you start thinking about what's next. And I was always a climber. It's great what I'm doing, but what can I do that's better? And so I had a manager at that point. He wasn't just an agent, he was a manager, a good friend. And I said, I want to, now that I'm between shows, network shows, I would like to take a shot at a game, at a talk variety show. He said, would you really? I said, yes, I would. So we started talking about it, and we started noising it around and asking around whether or not whether or not anyone else thought it was a viable idea. And so we put together a little package, a general format. Me as the host. I had in mind when I was a kid, there was a radio show called Don McNeil's Breakfast Club, and my mother religiously watched that, listened to that show, and I wanted to have a family like that. So I said to my manager, I want to have a boy singer and a girl singer and a little musical group. And I want to be the host, and that's what I want to do. And so we just started playing around with it. It turns out that it was a very overly ambitious thing to have all of that to start out with. But anyway, that's what I wanted. And so we started looking around, and I finally, I said, I need somebody, though, who knows how to do a game show, or rather a talk show. And so I knew in the industry, I knew about a guy by the name of Roger Ailes, who was doing the Mike Douglas show. And I also read where he had just left the Mike Douglas show. And so I said, that's the kind of guy, I didn't even know him. I said, that's the kind of guy, though, I knew about his reputation for building a show, that I need. I need somebody to be an executive producer. So I went after him, and I found him in Cincinnati. And he was producing with another host, I forget his name right now, a guy who had a local show in Cincinnati that they had hoped to take into Cincinnati. Everybody wanted to do the same thing. They want to take a Mike Douglas type show and expand. And he was back there doing that. And I told him, he knew who I was, so I said, I want to do a talk show. He said, oh, really? And so I said, yeah, I want to talk to you about it. You want to talk? And so he said, yeah, we'll talk. So we talked. And eventually he agreed to do it, and he came out to the West Coast to do it. So I had my package. I had Roger, and I had my manager. I had me, and I found a boy singer, John McCormick. I found a girl singer, Kelly Garrett. And then I had a family I had Dave Pell on the orchestra, 5 pieces. Dave Pell was he had a very successful and great movie music writer, producer, orchestra leader, saxophonist. He did everything. He was wonderful. Anyway, I had the whole thing put together, and we went on the air, and it didn't work. We tried it for, I think, 10 or 11 weeks, and it went off. I mean, through Roger, we found a company in New York who bankrolled it, and they quickly decided that it wasn't going to work, and it cost too much money. And now that harks back to, now that I think back, if I had been smart and just said, I'll just have me and an announcer like Jack Parr and Hugh Downs, or Johnny Carson and and Eddie McMahon. Just forget about the family. Just keep the two of you, maybe a little orchestra, and then go from there. A much leaner, more manageable type of format. But I didn't. I went overboard, and it didn't work. But we got it on the air with a few stations. I don't know how many stations, but we got it going. Didn't work.
It's interesting that you had Roger Ailes as your producer, who, as you note, had been the successful producer behind Mike Douglas,
Yeah.
later produced The Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder, had been written about by Joe McGinnis in his famous book, The Selling of the President in 1968, as
Yeah.
Richard Nixon's campaign advisor, who, due to his media advice, helped boost Nixon to the presidency. Were you... Considering what Roger Ailes has done in the intervening years and the continuing escalating success he has had, does that surprise you at all, or from knowing him, would you see him as the kind of guy who would continue to scale those heights higher and higher?
No, it didn't surprise me at all. He has a number of qualities. Number one, he has a natural ability to survey a scene and know what the touch points are. What's going on, whether it be in show business or in politics, what's going on, what can be done better, and who can do it. Those things. He has always been that way. He was pretty much responsible for Dick Nixon because he cleaned up his act quite a bit, because Dick Nixon was in politics and all of that, and knew a lot of people, but he didn't know from Shinola about what to do or how to do it. And Roger shaped him and told him, this is what we're going to do. And he dressed him up and bolstered him and made him into the president. So that's the kind of guy he was. And he also has, besides a keen intellect, he has a keen and sometimes very wicked sense of humor. But that takes you a long way. When things really get tough, it helps to have somebody in the room who can punch a hole in the balloon by bringing up a point of levity and taking the heat off of a situation. And Roger was the kind of a guy who could pull together an organization and give it aim it in certain directions, and then keep it light through humor, and thereby win everybody over. And that's what he does. That is what he does. Now, he also happens to be a man, when it comes to politics, who is very heavily invested in a particular philosophy, we'll call it, and which is left wing.
A right wing.
I'm sorry, right wing. And that's where he is today. He's still in it. He's no longer with Fox, but he's always been a right winger. When he did my show, there was no politics involved, and nor did I think he would ever get it. I didn't know anything about his political acumen until later on. But when I saw it, it didn't surprise me. That's what I'm saying. It didn't surprise me because he was sharp. He was sharp. He could sit in a meeting and say, okay, all right, we've talked to everybody. Here's what we're going to do. Boom, boom, boom. You're going to do this. You're going to do that. Let us go. He was a general.
Well, because he did have such a record of success with talk shows before your show and afterward, you've given us some ideas about why you think the show didn't work. You say maybe you should have had a more scaled-down show. What are your thoughts on why Roger was not able to put the show together in the way that would work? And as the weeks passed and perhaps the show wasn't gelling, did he try to make changes in the show to make it work?
No. He didn't have time to do all that. No. The outfit in New York who was bankrolling didn't even offer any options or any outs. They didn't say, let's play with it. They decided after a few weeks it wasn't working, and they couldn't justify the monies that, when you operate it, when you put a show on the air, somebody's got to put up some money somewhere, and so there's a risk involved. And they didn't feel that the people they were going after for money would stand still for a a wobbly show, which they considered this to be, and it was a wobbly show. And incidentally, I wasn't all that hot either. I had a lot to learn. I'm a slow learner. I've always been slow. I'm like the turtle. I'm just a slow guy. I'll get there eventually, but I'm slow. So my point is this: Roger didn't have a chance. They didn't offer him an option. When they called him first because he was the contact with them. They said, "The show, we're pulling the rug." And he said, "Are you?" And they said, "Yes, we're sure. We've had 2 or 3 meetings on this, and we're not. This is not just a haphazard phone call. We're pulling the rug." And so he said, "Well, okay." And so we glided out. We did a few more shows because we had already made a few commitments about booking celebrities, and peacefully went into the background, faded into nothingness.
This may be too specific a question. I don't know, but I'll ask it anyway. On the pilot show, which you shared with me, you interviewed Russ Meyer.
Yeah.
Russ Meyer, who in those days was on the Fox lot shooting Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, who had been an exploitation filmmaker, who was now, for whom Fox had thrown the doors open with a big budget.
You just said Fox. That's the studio I was trying to think of with Lucy. Fox. Go ahead. That's the studio I was trying to think of.
For a show that's going out to Middle America and to the housewives in 1969, to put on as the pilot, to put Russ Meyer on, it's pretty risque.
It was very risque, and that's why Roger had it in there. He said, "We're going to have to plow some new territory with this show. If we want to make an impression, we have to come." And so that was a very typical Roger Ailes spot. That's exactly what it was, and that's why he did it. It was borderline. Porno was a word that was being played in those days, played with, and it was the beginning of a sexual revolution.
And it's interesting to note that Meyer comes on the show kind of contrary to his image in a tuxedo.
Yeah.
He's coming on very formally. He was really an old world guy.
He's Mr. Cool.
In bringing this topic to a close, you've said that you like talk shows. You had tried one before. When this didn't go, and you've said in this conversation that you were a slow learner, how did you feel about, this didn't work out? Did it matter, or was it just, I'll go on to another show, or was the fact that the talk show didn't work out, was that a big deal?
It was a big deal in that I had often wanted to do that, but when it went, I understood it. That's it. I put myself in the other guy's shoes, and I said, if I were them, and I'm investing money in this thing, I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing this going and that going, and I would say I'd pull the rug too, say it just wasn't happening fast enough. That was also the beginning. It was not only a sexual revolution, but in the industry, at large, they were. When I say they, the powers that be and all the networks were becoming less and less patient with shows. You had to have an instant hit, or you were off. They would go for 26, and if you didn't make it, you're off. Then they would go for 13, and if they didn't make it, they were. And then they cut it. Nowadays, they do a pilot, and whether or not you're off, so things were happening, and when it happened, and I understood that, and I said, well, that's what's going on, and we're part of the mix. I understood it. So I was sadly disappointed, but we gave it our best shot.
One more thing I meant to ask you about that show. Where did you come up with the title, The Real Tom Kennedy Show? Because
everybody wanted to know, what are you going to do on your show? And I said, well, everybody has an idea of who I am and what I am, but I said, they only know me as a game show host, so I'm going to show them the real Tom Kennedy. And then they said, okay, we'll call it The Real Tom Kennedy Show.
Okay, let's maybe do
Pretty
one more.
Clever, huh?
Maybe let's do one more and maybe take a little short break. But
okay.
Before we do that, after this show, or maybe concurrent to your taping of this show, I don't know, you taped a pilot for something. I couldn't find any video. I couldn't find any real information on a show you taped for Heater Quigley called The Golden Triangle.
Oh, yeah.
1970. What can you tell us about the Golden Triangle?
Oh, Lord. It was a very complicated, it was one of those there was one of those intricately formatted shows. And the the contestants, it was all contestants. It was a quiz show. A single contestant, and then two, and then three, and they looked like, pool balls in a rack. And it was built on a slant. And I was down at the bottom asking questions, and I can't remember exactly how it worked, but we used to go up the triangle, and it was called the Golden Triangle. That's the name of the show, and that's where it came from, the shape of it. It had a very complicated format. I couldn't begin to tell you about it today. I've forgotten all about it, except I remember we worked and we worked and we worked on that thing. It was NBC, wasn't it? NBC?
Well, because it was unsold, I don't suppose it was
I think
any
it was NBC
network.
Studios. We went into that studio like on whatever it was, let's say a Thursday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and we didn't leave till 3 o'clock in the morning. And we were shooting, and that didn't work. Well, shoot it again this way. Now let's do the. We were working and reworking the format, reworking the camera angles, reworking the entire show, trying to do a decade's worth of work in a matter of hours. And we just worked our little fannies off until 3 o'clock in the morning. We finally ended up with, if you wanted to sit still and follow all those intricate rules that the guy was giving, the guy meaning me, it was a fairly plausible show, but who could possibly sit and watch it from day to day? It didn't work. It was too complicated. It was a kind of a cute show, not cute. It was kind of a good idea that overgrew itself, if that's a word.
Was this your first association with Heater Quigley?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I did, to say the least. I don't know when that was before. I think that was after that.
To say the least comes along a little later.
Yeah, okay. So that was my introduction to Heater Quigley, yeah.
And because you say this show didn't work and that you tried to make it work, were there ever shows that you were offered as an MC that you said, guys, I don't think that show's going to work and I'm just not going to even tape it?
There was one. And I can't even say it to this day because it's still running. I mean, it runs from time to time. There was a show that was offered me. It was already on the air. Once again, I forgot the reason the host left for whatever reason, and they wanted me, and I turned it down. It was the first show I'd really turned down. And my manager said, "Why? What's wrong with you? It's a proven product." I said, "It doesn't really work." I said, "If you watch that show, it has a flaw in it that is, to me, inadmissible." He said, "What are you talking about?" And we ran the show, and I said, "Right there." I said, "That's pure chance. It has nothing to do with skill. It has nothing to do with knowledge. That's pure happenstance." And he said, "So what?" I said, "I don't like it. It's not a legitimate show. If they had a legitimate reason for that person to win that, then that's okay. But that person got it because he or she got lucky." And it went on, and it went on and on and on, and it still comes back. It's one of those shows that and to this day, it still has that flaw in it. But I'm the only one who sees it, I guess. But I didn't like it. So now I'm getting haughty, aren't I?